We're live, okay. I'm going to call to order. And at this point, attendance. Isabel Unger, student trustee Isabel has called in regrets. Arabella Solvay, she's supposed to be here, the other student trustee. And Kathy Cook and Ron Claire are, I guess they're going to be a little late. So I would like somebody to ask for a approval of the agenda. Linda?
Yes.
Yes. Who else? Put your hand up.
I'll second it.
Okay, who's that? Oh, Gail?
Yes.
Okay. All in favor?
Support.
Anybody opposed? Okay. Declaration of conflict of interest. Anybody? Amy's here, right?
Yes, I am, Alan. Sorry, I couldn't get this too. It froze on me. I'm here.
Okay. All right, we have presentations with Superintendent Armstrong and her deputy, Sean. Unfortunately, we don't have overheads tonight, PowerPoints, I'm sorry. Literally, administration has been working around the clock to get this together, so Shelley tells me that she'll send it out to us later for our records. Let's go. Shelley, you all set?
Yeah, absolutely. Just waiting for the slide to change here. Is the slide going to come up, Rochelle?
Hello, it's Rochelle.
Hi, is the PowerPoint going to come up, please?
Yes, it is.
Thank you.
Hold on here. There you go.
Awesome, thank you so much. So this is Superintendent Armstrong. Before I begin the presentation, I would like to take a moment to thank the finance team for their hard work and commitment. This has been another unusual budget process, and a lot of additional work and effort was put forth by my team. Sean Mayhew was responsible for preparing the budget and creating the budget package which you have before you. Jackie Farrell was responsible for calculating the budgeted salaries and benefits, including the impact of ratified central collective agreements. Given that salaries and benefits represent 80% of budgeted expenditures, this was no small undertaking. Leah Beneteau and Kathy Kaufman have had a very important role in contributing to the underlying work supporting our ministry Ppfs submission, projecting deferred revenues, contributed capital, and amortization expense. And of course, Tammy Malash is an invaluable team member. She is responsible for keeping us all on track and handling the tremendous amount of administrative work required through this process. I would also like to specifically thank Tammy for being so flexible with her scheduled vacation when a late ministry announcement last week required further updating to our budget information package. And I'd like to send my thanks to everybody. Next slide, please. So today we're going to take you through an overview of the budget risks, funding changes, operating expenses, budget details, and then myself and Mr. Mayhew would be happy to answer any questions. Next, please. And next again. So today we have for you a balanced operating budget of $473.2 million for the 2020-21 school year. a balanced capital budget of $80.5 million for the 2020-21 school year, and as well a drawdown of $953,000 against accumulated capital surplus for amortization of committed capital projects funded directly by the board. Next, please. This draft budget meets the ministry compliance requirements as outlined on this slide. The operating budget is a balanced, but there is a deficit for compliance purposes of $953,000. This is similar to the prior year, and it represents the amortization of the committed capital project surplus related to LaSalle Public School, Better Schools Energy Retrofit, Campbell Public School, and the administration building. To provide clarity of the ministry's compliance requirements, 1% of the operating revenue allocation is $4,249,000 as outlined on Appendix 4. This budget reflects $1.8 million of COVID-related expenditures that have been funded by the ministry. This will be discussed in further detail later in the presentation. Next. This slide presents an overview of the operating revenues and expenditures, net of committed capital. Next, please. And next again. One of the more significant risks to the budget pertains to the COVID-19 pandemic. The GSN, which was released on June the 19th, 2020, funds a conventional learning model. The GSN funding is based on the assumption that schools will reopen in the fall to all students and that they will remain open for the entire 2020-21 school year. Boards have been advised to be diligent in managing costs and carefully review all discretionary program spending in their 2020-21 school year budgets. A diligent approach to budgeting has been the board's approach over the past years, including this current year. The most recent ministry announcement on August the 4th indicated the ministry's commitment of $309 million in new funding for extraordinary costs for the COVID-19 pandemic. Next, please. As part of the GSN funding announcement on June the 19th, the ministry provided funding through the GSN for additional mental health supports and technology-related costs. Next, please. As previously mentioned, on August the 4th, the ministry issued a memorandum regarding investments to support school reopening in response to the COVID-19 outbreak. This slide outlines the allocations to the GECDSB from the August 4th announcement. The budget reflects the board's allocated ministry funding of $1.8 million, as well as an equal and offsetting funded COVID-19 expenditures. It is important to note, however, that budget expenditures may vary for a number of reasons, and I will talk to that in the next slide. Based on information that we currently know, the board is working very hard to prepare for the resumption of school in September. We acknowledge the health and safety of students and staff are a critical consideration. Projecting COVID-19 expenses for the 2020-21 school year is challenging due to the evolving circumstances related to the pandemic and implications to reopening schools. Some of these challenges include the learning model and any potential changes or adaptations to the learning model based on the progression of the virus, the number of students who will be attending in-person instruction versus remote learning, the number of transportation eligible students who opt out of transportation, load capacity limits on school buses, additional technology and internet connectivity requirements of students. So as you can see on this slide, we've done our best to provide projections in terms of some of these costs, but based on some of the factors that I've mentioned, we need further time in order to refine these costs. Consideration will also need to be given to the amount of in-year savings that will be available to address pandemic-related expenses, And this would be available through the redirection of unspent budget allocations. The amount of expenses that can be incurred with 2019-20 savings in preparation for the 2020-21 school year, and the potential for further investments by the ministry to support COVID-19 expenses. We will revise the projected expenditures in conjunction with the submission of our revised estimates to the ministry in December 2020, once further information is known and when we can refine the projected expenditures. As I've indicated, in terms of costs, we've been able to quantify some of them at this time. So for example, masks for students. We know that masks for students in grade 4 to 12 inclusive are mandatory. Masks for students from JK to grade 3 are recommended, but not required. The board will have a supply of masks available for all students, and that's reflected in the costing that we've noted on this slide. PPE. All staff will be provided with 2 masks per day. Teaching staff will also be provided with face shields. Spec ed workers will be provided with gloves, gowns, face shields, and masks. Custodial staff will be provided with masks and nitrile gloves. We have allowed contingency for price variances and changing guidelines. The board is procuring 2 months of PPE based on a competitive tender process. Additionally, the Ministry of Government and Consumer Services has also procured for the non-health sector and is an available source of supply to the board. This should assist with achieving cost efficiencies. And for that, we also have been able to project those costs, as you'll note on this slide. Other safety measures include the procurement of stickers for floors to assist in directional flow and occupancy signs. Facility Services is in the process of visiting every school, meeting with principals and measuring all office spaces. Vinyl barriers are being constructed internally. Additional cleaning costs include the hiring of additional replacement custodians to supplement the existing complement of replacement custodians. Replacement custodians will be redeployed to all board facilities and will focus on cleaning and disinfecting high-touch surfaces. With respect to transportation, discussions are ongoing regarding the PPE costs of bus operators and who will be responsible for covering the costs, along with the additional cleaning and disinfecting of buses. Additional bus runs may be required. This will depend on bus routing and bus occupancy limits. As the banker board, the board will be procuring the PPE for the Transportation Consortium. And as you will note on this slide, we've reflected what we've been able to estimate at this time. We've also shown what the funding is that we were provided last week from the ministry so that you can see the incremental expenses that are not included in the 2020-21 budget. Next slide, please. Other budget risks stemming from the COVID-19 pandemic include the impact on international enrollment and tuition revenue. Immigration and Citizenship Canada is not processing applications normally and is unable to provide accurate processing times. They are prioritizing applications from Canadians trying to return to Canada, vulnerable people, and people who perform or support essential services. We've also paused all rentals and community use of schools, except where we are obligated to provide the service or where there is an existing lease agreement. These programs, however, do run on a cost recovery basis. Next, please. There are a number of other risks that require consideration. For example, enrollment. Any variability in actual enrollment compared to the enrollment projections used for purposes of developing the budget would result in an impact to operating grants. With respect to the labor framework, the collective agreements were ratified centrally. Salary benchmarks throughout the grants for student needs funding reflect an increase of 1% effective August 31st, 2019, and another 1% effective August 31st, 2020. This excludes directors, supervisory officers, NBE staff, including principals and vice principals. With respect to benefits transformation, the retiree group has yet to transfer to an employee health life trust. Timing for transition is not determinable, and any one-time costs associated with the transition of retirees to an EHLT is unknown and not reflected in the budget. Regarding supply and replacement staff, this is a normal risk to our budget, but it may be further influenced by the impact of COVID-19 on our staffing complement. Special education. This is an area typically underfunded, and as such, the board has reallocated non-envelope funding to support the needs in this area. This is influenced by the changing and the greater needs of students in our system. Utilities. On May the 1st, 2020, the Ontario government issued an emergency order to temporarily reduce the global adjustment rates to pre-COVID-19 monthly levels for April, May, and June. The order provides a deferral of the global adjustment charges and is expected to approximate a 15% reduction of actual global adjustment costs. The interim cost avoidance is expected to be recovered over a 12-month period beginning January 2021. If the economy recovers and the demand for electricity is high, the impact of the recovery of the global adjustment is estimated at $240,000. If there is a second wave and there is another shutdown, or the economy is slow to recover, the impact of the recovery of the global adjustment could be as high as $689,000. With respect to defibrillators, Bill 141, which is Defibrillator Registration and Public Access Act, had its third reading on March the 11th, 2020. Its status is awaiting royal assent. If passed, and the regulation provides further clarification on all public sites, such as schools, to have defibrillators. The board currently has 25 defibrillators in our system, which are registered, marked, labeled, and maintained. They include placement at every secondary school, 7 of our elementary schools, our admin building, facility services, our adult learning center, and migration hall. We may need to purchase an additional 54 defibrillators for the remainder of our system at a total projected cost of $136,000. This timing would be dependent on the requirements of the Act and the associated regulation. With respect to WSIB, the board is a Schedule II employer under the WSIB Act and assumes responsibility for the payment of all claims to its injured workers under the Act. The board does not fund these obligations in advance of the payments. As costs continue to rise and the complexity of work-related injuries increases, there is a risk that claims and costs are greater than budgeted. With respect to capital and deferred maintenance, this is a normal risk to our budget, and it's really related to our aging infrastructure and the fact that there could be unanticipated expenditures related to it. And then, of course, we do have the status of funding announcements and other policy changes. The board does need to be responsive and reactive to evolving changes to funding and changes in the education system. Next. This slide gives a graph for you of the elementary enrollment. Obviously, enrollment is a key driver in the grant calculations. In the elementary panel for 2021, we are projecting an increase of 196 ADE, which is average daily enrollment, when we're comparing budget to budget. When we compare to our revised estimates, which is based on our snapshot that we take on October 31st, 2019, there is a decrease of 155 average daily enrollment. And I think we've lost our slides. So we can check on that. Thank you for that. This is a snapshot now of our secondary enrollment. And for 2021, we are projecting a decrease of 123.5 average daily enrollment, again comparing budget to budget. This includes 21 average daily enrollment students related to international. If we compare to the revised estimates, which again is a snapshot that we take at October 31st, 2019, there's a decrease of 72.5 average daily enrollment. Next, please. And this slide provides you with a picture of the total enrollment. And when we compare budget to budget 2020 to 21 versus 2019 to 20, there's an overall enrollment increase of 72.5 students. And when we compare from October of 2019 to September of 2020, there's a decrease of 227.5 average daily enrollment. And next slide, please. And I will ask Sean to speak regarding salaries and benefits.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's Sean Mayu, Manager of Finance. I'll pick up here. We lost the slides there again. Okay, back up. Thanks for that. As mentioned, salaries and benefits represent approximately 80% of the entire operating budget. The next few slides will review some assumptions, changes with respect to salaries and benefits. The funding for salaries and benefits is primarily based on the 9 recently ratified central agreements. Salary benchmarks, as Superintendent Armstrong mentioned already, are increasing 1% September 1st, 2020. That excludes the director, senior administration, and principals, vice principals. There's a retroactive 1% increase for September 1st, 2019. So I think it's just important to highlight that when we're looking at budget to budget, the funding benchmarks are actually providing an increase of 2.01%. The teacher qualifications and experience allocation and the ECE qualifications and experience allocation both recognize grid movement on September 1st, 2020. And I'll just mention that overall the salary increases and grid movement are funded increases. So we have corresponding expenses that offset those increases. Next slide, please. With respect to the benefits, all active employee groups have transitioned to their respective Employee Health Life Trust, the EHLT. Certain groups have not yet transferred and are not going to transfer. The board maintains separate benefit plans for small groups such as custodial, skilled trade retirees, NB surviving spouses, etc. That represents approximately 190 individuals. And I just want to point that out because the EHLT rates are set by the various collective agreements. So when we're budgeting for the benefit rates, it's a pretty standard calculation. We just take the total annual amount, we times it, we multiply it by the total amount of staff to get what the benefit cost is. With respect to those groups that we maintain separately in separate plans, there's a bit of risk there that those rates will be subject to increases, decreases, and of course there's a valuation done on those retiree benefits which could impact the budgets, and I believe that was highlighted as a risk earlier. The GSN does include a government contribution stabilization funding amount of $3.6 million to assist with the enhancements and the increased costs of the HLTs in accordance with the collective agreements. And I mentioned that additional one-time costs could be incurred that are not budgeted in this area based on those risks. Next slide. essentially, there's no change in the budget to replacement costs for occasional teachers, educational support staff, and casual custodians. That represents $10.7 million of expenses that are budgeted in our current budget proposed. $8.1 million relates to occasional teachers. You can see that in the appendix. And then also within the other sections, there's $1 million provided for EAs. There's $500,000 provided for ECEs, and there's $1.1 million provided for casual custodians. So you can see that's a significant expense to the board. And the details of the plan really are laid out there. I'm not going to read them, but essentially the same plan continues. There's the 11 sick days that each employee can use at 100%, and then they're provided some top-up measures based on the agreements. And this continues to be a significant risk to the board. We have not put into the budget here any considerations for what COVID-19 could have on supply and occasional costs, as Superintendent Armstrong mentioned earlier, so that's a risk. Next slide, please. And you should all be familiar with the two liabilities that we need to essentially amortize or expense for compliance purposes. These are ministry adjustments. The first one is a liability for retirement benefits. And we have to realize an expense of $1.5 million with respect to that, and there's 7 years remaining, so we'll have to incur that similar expense over the next 7 years. The retirement gratuity liability, there's a liability of about 9.9, and we're seeing in our budget $3.4 million of expense for compliance purposes related to that. And there's 2.9 years remaining for that particular liability to be brought into compliance. So I guess really in summary here, once those amortization periods run out, we'll be able to have more room in our budget for other operating expenses. Next slide. And I'll turn it back over to Shelley here.
Thank you, Sean. This section we're going to review now will outline some of the key funding changes in the 2020-21 draft budget. Oops. I think we need to go back one more. No, we got to go back. We need to go back to slide 22, please.
Hi, Shelley, it's Rochelle. My apologies. Can you just tell me what way I'm headed?
You need to go backward. No, it's all good. I appreciate the help. You need to go backward to slide 22.
Sorry, I don't have any slide numbers on here, so I don't know.
Start with compensation pupil foundation grant. Okay, that's great. Move for next slide, please. Okay, thank you for that. With respect to compensation, the salary benchmarks throughout the GSM have been increased, as I mentioned, by 1%, excluding the director, senior administration staff, NBE, and principals and vice principals. A 1% retroactive increase was negotiated for September 1st, 2019. And again, I would like to mention that these were centrally negotiated items. When comparing the 2020-21 budget to the 2019-20 budget, an effective increase of 2.01% to benchmarks has been provided in the GSN. This funding increase is directly offset by increased salary expenditures. Next. In the 2019-20 budget, funding was based on a secondary class size ratio of 28:1, although staffing reflected the class size limits as per the terms of the locally negotiated collective agreements of 22:1. As a result, transition funding was provided to offset the impact, which was known as the Teacher Job Protection Fund. For 2020-21, the centrally negotiated class size ratio is 23:1. As a result, there is a net decrease of $3.4 million in funding, budget to budget, which represents a change from 28:1 to 23:1, and the elimination of the Job Teacher Protection Fund. Next. As announced in the fall of 2019, students will be required to take 2 online credits to graduate from secondary school. As part of this transition, an online learning adjustment has been applied in the cost adjustment and teacher qualifications and experience grant in recognition of maximum class size averages of 35 for online courses. As a result, a funding decrease of $28,000 is included in the budget. Next. The ministry is increasing the supply teacher benchmarks by the equivalent of 1 additional day to recognize school board's experience with sick leave usage. This benchmark increase represents additional funding of approximately $511,000. Next. The cost adjustment and teacher qualifications and experience grant has been adjusted for secondary class sizes, and it has also been offset by an increase in teacher salaries, resulting in an increase in funding of $2.4 million. Next. Additional education software licensing is funding that supports learning in and outside the classroom. It is being transferred to the GSN from existing ministry software licenses as they expire to provide school boards with flexibility to better address local needs. The board receives the minimum of $30,000 of funding for this purpose. Next. New in 2020-21, the Supports for Students Fund and Investment in System Priorities provides flexible funding for school boards to support the learning needs of students. This total funding of $3,736,000 is included in the budget. This funding is directly offset by additional salary and benefit expenses, representing 31 full-time equivalent positions that have been budgeted and the additional salaries and related benefit expenses. These positions will be reviewed in further detail later in the presentation. Next. Included in the budget is $560,000 of declining enrollment adjustment funding, as projected enrollment is less than enrollment reported in the fall of 2019 as part of the revised estimate submission. This grant may be eliminated if actual enrollment in 2020-21 is greater than projected. Next. This is the final year of a 4-year phase-in of the funding impacts of the new school foundation grant definition of a school based on a campus, introduced in 2017-18. A campus is defined as a property or properties owned, leased, or rented by a school board that are linked by a contiguous property line. Previously, funding was based on the school identification. Since Bellwood Public School and Giles Campus French Immersion Public School have the same school ID, and Forest Glade Public School and Forest Glade Primary Learning Center also share the same school ID, only 2 of these locations out of the 4 qualified for SFG funding prior to the change. Each location is now considered its own campus and all qualify for funding. This additional funding in the amount of $337,000 is being phased in over 4 years. Therefore, 100% of the additional funding is being provided in 2020-21, which is an increase of $84,000 compared to the prior year. Next. As previously explained, international student tuition is impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic. In 2019-20, there were approximately 250 students in the international students program. The budget for 2020-21 only includes 179 students based on projected enrollment at the time of classroom staffing. There is the risk that actual enrollment in the program is lower due to the implications of the COVID-19 pandemic and the timelines of processing student permits by Immigration and Citizenship Canada. As a result, the revenue is projected to decrease by $300,000. Next. Included in our budget is a revenue increase of $600,000 associated with Jordan's principal. This is funding from the Government of Canada, and the funding will offset salaries and benefits that are paid to 12 full-time equivalent educational assistants for supporting our Indigenous students. Next. Priorities and partnership funding are included in the budget if board-by-board allocation is known at the time of budget preparation. This slide provides a summary of the changes in the Ppfs. Overall, there is a slight decrease when comparing budget to budget based on what was announced at the time of finalizing both the current and prior year's budgets. The mental health workers amount, which supports 3.5 social workers, is transferred to the GSN for 2020-21. Also, the experiential learning grant, which supports a full-time consultant, is also transferred to the GSN. It's important to note that after the preparation of the budget, the PPF for Focus on Youth was announced in the amount of $350,000. The impact on the bottom line is nil, since the budgeted revenues will equal the projected expenditures. Next. The school operations allocation has been updated to reflect a 2% benchmark update to the non-staff portion to assist with managing increases in commodity prices. In addition, in order to streamline funding and to reduce administrative burden for transfer payments, a series of partnership and priority fundings have been transferred to the GSN. Funding levels remain consistent. These include mental health workers, experiential learning, curriculum and assessment implementation, and executive compensation related to 2017-18. As well, in January 2020, the ministry launched a review of student transportation, which aims to achieve a more equitable and needs-based student transportation system. While the review is underway, the overall student transportation grant will be maintained at the previous year's funding level with adjustments for enrollment. Next. Based on the Office of the Auditor General of Ontario's 2017 Value for Money audit, stakeholder feedback, and data analysis on factors that disadvantage students, the ministry has made adjustments to 3 allocations as noted on this slide. The program leadership allocation has been moved from the School Board Administration and Governance Grant to become its own grant, called the Program Leadership Grant. The Learning Opportunities Grant has been restructured into 2 components, the Experiential Learning Envelope and the Targeted Student Supports Envelope. And the Library Staff allocation is moved from the LOG Grant to the School Foundation Grant. Next. To better reflect their current purpose and in response to stakeholder feedback, the ministry renamed 4 allocations as noted on this slide. Next. And I'd like to turn it over to Mr. Mayhew.
Shelley did a great job bringing us through all the significant funding changes year over year. And this section now is going to review the operating expenses throughout the budget and really compare the budget with the prior year. I'll highlight the significant changes. Next slide. This graph shows a snapshot of the 2021 budgeted operating expenses, the breakdown of the ministry columns or categories, I should say. You can see that salaries and benefits represent approximately 80% of the budget. Non-salary and benefit budgets were thoroughly reviewed by the senior leadership team and reduced where possible, increased where it was necessary. For example, increase in commodity prices or service contracts. So throughout the budget, we were really, the attempt really here was to try and maintain where possible, and there really is not a lot of wiggle room in the budget as we move through the expenses. Next slide. Since we keep saying the majority of the budget is representative of wages, I think it's important to highlight all the staffing changes budget to budget. The next 3 slides provide a summary of the FTE or full-time equivalent changes to the staffing complement, comparing the prior year budget with the current year budget. The comments will focus on the change excluding the Student Support Fund and Investment in System Priority Fund, which is discussed later. You can see that there's an increase of elementary teachers of 24 which is an alignment of teacher funding and class size requirements and adjustments for changes in enrollment. There's a decrease of 16.8 secondary teachers. Last year's budget, we needed to staff 22-1 to maintain collective agreement, local collective agreement language. Now we're seeing a transition from the 22-1 staffing to 23-1, which results in that decrease. There's 24.5 educational assistants that are added budget to budget. 12 of those are directly funded by the Jordan's Principal, the funding that we mentioned earlier. 3 are to support the 3 new gains classrooms that are created effective September 2020. And there's 9.5 additional EAs to just meet is an investment to meet student needs. There's 6 professional and other educational support staff budget to budget increase. And that's there's 2 that are support workers for the deaf and hard of hearing to meet student needs. There's 3 DSWs that are also to support those gains classrooms. And then there's an additional DSW to support system needs. Next slide. The 6.5 increase in consultants isn't actually an increase in consultants. It's just a reclassification of positions from the board administration and governance line. And it's net of an increase of 1.0 FTE program secretary. As Shelley mentioned earlier, the program lead allocation is broken out of the board administration grant now in the funding model, and it's provided for in a separate grant. And that funding flows through the consultant line, so we need to match our expenses, so we're reclassifying positions. There's a decrease of 1 FTE secondary vice principal budget to budget, and there's an increase of 0.5 custodians, which is an increase in system needs related to space. Next slide. The 4.5 is the reclassification of the consultants line, a net of an increase of 1 purchasing clerk, which is supported fully by the specialist high skills major program. And you'll see a decrease of 1 FTE in employment services. Overall, there's a 38.2 increase in positions budget to budget, which exclude the additional positions related to the support for students fund and investment in system priorities. If we compare actual staffing in 2019 to 20, which is the revised budget back in the fall, we'd actually see that FTE is down by 28 positions, excluding the impact of those new positions created by the collective agreements. Next slide. And here's that snapshot of the positions that were filled with the Student Support Fund. Next slide. The following slides will provide an overview of the appendices in your budget binder. Next slide. This shows the total change in teacher expenses, budget to budget. This accounts for the increase of 24 elementary teachers, the decrease of 16.8 secondary teachers due to class size, and an increase of 6 secondary teachers with the student support fund money. That represents $1.2 million net increase in salaries. There's a $5.4 million increase in grid and grid placement, so average salaries essentially has increased year over year. And there's a $2.0 million budgeted for an increase in benefits related to all those changes. And for compliance calculation purposes, you'll see the expense for the amortization of employee future benefits is reported on this slide as well. Next slide. This slide shows the total budgeted costs for occasional teachers. Actual costs in 2018-19 were $8.6 million. These costs primarily relate to illness. Overall, the budget level was maintained year over year. As we mentioned, there is risk that the actual occasional costs could be higher than budgeted. However, we've decided to maintain the current level of budget given the trend in absences. Next slide. This is a list that shows the change in budget in support staff. Overall, there's a 9.5 FTE increase in these positions compared to current staffing levels. That's the fall staffing levels. Of those, 6 FTE support the opening of the 3 gains classrooms, as I've mentioned, and 12 EAs, as I've mentioned before, are directly supported by Jordan's principal funding. Next slide. And as we mentioned earlier, we have to find monies throughout the GSN funding to fund or subsidize the deficit that we incur in special education. This is not a new thing. This year, the deficit is projected to be $5.4 million and represents an increase of $0.8 million from the prior year budget. And really, we just see that the needs of the students continue to increase and the complexity of the needs continue to increase, and that results in additional support required, and that's at additional cost. Next slide. Appendix 7, this slide in particular, it just shows the change in total cost is just representative of the impact of the staffing changes, net of wage and benefit increases. Obviously, there's the change in grid and grid placements, and that is a result of the increase year over year. Next slide. The only change here was there's a slight increase in the school aids, and that's just to align with actual costs. Otherwise, everything was kept consistent here. Next slide. Again, understanding the budgetary pressures we have discussed, the approach to textbooks and supplies, which is Appendix 8 of your package, was to maintain the budget and potentially reduce where possible. What I'm going to do is, as I just move through the appendices, I'm just going to highlight the changes year over year and tell you what the result of those changes are. The board action plan is increased slightly to offset the increase in enveloped funding. The agent fees have been reduced as a result of the decrease in budgeted international students. And you'll note here on this slide that we've maintained the $300,000 in other board initiatives, which is really a director's contingency. And that's important to ensure we have flexibility to address any budgetary pressures. Next slide. The Learning Opportunities Grant expenses, those expenses have increased slightly to offset an increase in the enveloped grant. The Outdoor Education expenses have increased slightly to offset an increase in the enveloped grant as well. The increase in the school information technology support represents a reclassification of expenses to this line from the admin line or the central portion. Overall, there's no increase in budget here, just a reclassification. The increase in school support is adjustments for specialist high skills majors and experiential learning envelopes that are representative of the non-wage portions. Next slide. There's a slight change in special education for adjustments made for the special education equipping amount and the claims that are projected. You'll see that the staffing contingency this year has been removed. Prior year, we set up $400,000. That was established to address the uncertainty of staffing positions in light of funding changes and in light of collective agreement implications, as those were being, we were coming into a new bargaining year. That money was used to staff positions in the fall and is no longer required in 2020-21. The urban and priority schools amount, the text portion is reduced by an increase in wages. Overall, the allocation for this amount is the same. However, because the wages are increasing, the portion available for supplies has to decrease, and that's why you see that decrease in that line item. The school allocation reflects impacts of changes in average daily enrollment, and there's also a slight correction of the prior period calculation. But overall, you'll see that the total textbook, classroom supplies, and other related classroom expenses have actually decreased a few $100,000. Next slide. With respect to staff development, the decrease here entirely relates to the new teachers induction program funding, or NTIP. There are less teachers on the grid who qualify for this funding. Funding is provided for the first 2 years of a new teacher's hire. Next slide. The changes in the principals and vice principals line reflects the changes in grid positions and the reduction of the one secondary VP, and the changes in related benefit costs associated with those positions. The school secretary's line, there are 6.5 positions added here as a result of this investment in system priorities funding. And of course, there's the change for the grid increases and grid position increases. The teacher consultants line reflects the reclassification of positions to this line for the program leadership allocation that we previously spoke about. That's why you'll see those salaries increasing in the teacher consultant line. Next slide. With respect to the director and SO line, or supervisory officer line, there's just a slight reclassification of wages to the consultant line as well as a result of the program lead allocation. The board administration line, there's reclassification of wages to the consultant line for the same reason, net of changes to grid position. And there's also the one additional position to support the specialist high skills major program as indicated earlier. The supplies line, it represents the reclassification of IT expenses to texts and supplies, as I discussed earlier. And the utilities line, utilities didn't go away, they're still there. We just reclassified that portion to the operations line. Next slide. With respect to other expenses, operations related, those salaries are increased for grid increases and grid position, and also the 4.5 additional custodians that are available through the Student Support Fund. Overall, operations, non-wage and benefits were maintained. There were some reclassifications within the categories of maintenance, supplies, and utilities to better reflect the pattern of actual expenses. However, for the most part, though, if you net all of those or bring them all together and look year over year, the budget was maintained. Debenture interest decreases as we pay down the debentures related to LaSalle and Better Places. And you'll see that there's a $32,000 increase in health and safety budget, which is related to the required lifting device inspections, which is a legislative requirement. Next slide. The total renewal amount of operating is consistent with the prior year. Renewal needs listed here are general nature and may be adjusted throughout the year based on the needs in the system. And you can see there's 370 plus 370 budget there for renewal operating. Next slide. There's a slight budgeted increase in transportation, which just represents just an increased overall cost in transportation related to routes and operator costs, etc. The Con Ed amount decreased slightly, and that just represents a reclassification of wages. Typically, however, any increases or decreases related to Con Ed is offset by increases or decreases to funding, as there's the ESL program, the LBS program, which are directly funded programs. Next slide. This budget represents employment services, and you can see the budget is maintained year over year. This budget supports offices in Windsor, Kingsville, and Leamington, and these programs are delivered throughout the school year and include employment services to help people in Windsor and Essex County find work. Another service is providing assessments for adult English language proficiency. Next slide. Appendix 2 of the binder goes through all the other revenue areas outside of the GSN. As Shelley mentioned earlier, the approach in budgeting for other revenue items is we budget what is known at the time of the budget is prepared. So only any board-by-board allocations that were provided at the time the budget was put together are included here. So if you see a decrease in a line, it doesn't necessarily mean we're losing that funding. It just means perhaps it hasn't been announced yet. You'll see the after-school skills development program. That was introduced actually in the 2019-20 year, similar level of funding, but last year it wasn't announced at the time of budget, so that's why that increase exists in that line. The community use of schools line, there has not yet been an announced board-by-board allocation, so we're not sure of our board funding in this area, if any. The COVID line you'll see is new. That's the amount to offset the total funding that was recently announced for COVID-related. The focus on youth line is showing down $350,000. As Shelley mentioned, it wasn't announced at the time we prepared the budget. Since I believe it was just recently this week, they announced $350,000 in funding, so that line initiative has been maintained year over year. The Fsl funding is consistent with the prior year. The French is a second language. In the prior year, though, because we did the budget a lot further in advance, we didn't know the specific amount, so we only allocated for a small portion to cover wages. This year we know the full amount, so we budgeted the full amount. The pilot for Black students, that was also announced in 1920. That supports the work of Dr. Ola, who was recently appointed to this position. Experiential learning, that's been moved to the GSN, so you'll see 0 there. The literacy numeracy grant, that's been adjusted, and it's just to reflect the actual funding level. In the prior year, we didn't include the funding that incorporated the Southwestern Detention Center. This year, we've done that. So we just really trued up the funding level, and of course, the expenses offset the funding. Next slide. The mental health workers were moved to the GSN. The miscellaneous government grants line, that represents employment services, and that's consistent level of funding as we discussed. The miscellaneous revenue line has increased $601,000. That entirely relates to the Jordan's principal funding. This lining also includes energy rebates, our solar revenue, and interest. The parents reaching out grants, we included a small portion, and that was just a portion that was announced at the time of budget prep. You'll notice a slight reduction in the math strategy amount. However, that line continues to support 2 consultants and professional development, primarily release time of teachers. Supporting students with severe learning disabilities and well-being, Ppfs. Those are not new again, but those amounts were announced at the time of budget prep, so we've included them. You'll see the tuition fees. You'll see that decrease that we spoke about because we are projecting a decrease in the total amount of fee-paying international students. And once we get to the revised budget in the fall, if there are any other amounts that have been announced or allocated, we'll revise this section and we'll include the appropriate expenses. Next slide. And this kind of wraps it, all the operating expenses all together and shows you the compliance adjustments. And this is how we essentially get to the amount that is in the board motion. The total operating budget is $473.2 million, which is a little over a $10 million increase year over year. Next slide. This shows you the continuity of our accumulated surplus. It shows you that we're drawing down our committed capital balances by the $953,000 of amortization, and that is representative right now of our deficit for compliance purposes. You'll see that we're not affecting the operating surplus in this budget. It remains at 19.7, which is the balance at August 31st, 2019. That could change. We've reported that there are savings, COVID-related savings in the current year, and we're working on finalizing this year. And as we get through this year and we push through all the remaining adjustments, year-end adjustments, accruals, the changes that are related to employee future benefits, we'll have a good idea as to if we're adding to that $19.7 million or not. But we would expect to, given what we've reported for our COVID savings thus far. Next slide. And again, this is just a summary of our slide we just saw a moment ago, showing the $953,000 deficit for compliance purposes and our closing balances. Next slide. So we spoke a bit about the operating budget. We're also, the board's also required to approve a capital budget. This budget does not include any allocation for an additional reduction of our capital deficit. Capital items presented in this budget are fully funded. Those past projects that we spoke about that are board supported are LaSalle Public School Better Schools Energy Retrofit and the debenture interest is paid from renewal in GSN. Those projects there are fully funded with accumulated surplus that we set aside a few years back, and we offset our capital deficit per se. And of course, the amortization on those reduce that reserve year to year. Next slide. Here's a snapshot of the capital budget, and that's provided in Appendix 3 of your package. And it really shows you all the different areas. Our approach for the capital budget is we budget for what is announced at the time, similar to the other revenue. And you'll see that we've got announced capital priorities for all those major programs, and we're budgeting $38.6 million for 2021. We're happy to see that the total renewal amount of $5.4 million and the total school condition improvement of 24.5 is maintained year over year. That's significant for us since a lot of that money helps us address our aging infrastructure. And you'll see the short-term interest on outstanding projects is fully funded. However, the capital budget this year, which is $80.5 million, is fully supported by funding. Next slide. And that brings us to our questions.
Okay. Thank you, Sean and Shelley. I'm going to go through the next couple of items, and then we'll put this on the table for questions. There are no presentations. There are no delegations and no new business. So I would like to have somebody put this recommendation for the budget on the table, and then we can have questions and debate. Anybody want to make the motion?
Alan, Trustee Leclerc has moved it, and Trustee Higginson has seconded it.
Okay. Okay, now we will go to questions.
Trustee Leclerc is in the queue.
Okay, thank you. Trustee Leclerc? Questions?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, thank you. I apologize for being a little delayed, a little bit more construction than we anticipated in moving today. My question to the budget is, I understand that most of our costs are incurred in salaries. This is a unique year. What percentage of the budget overall do you believe is affected by the pandemic?
Anybody take that one?
Well, it's tough to say what percentage. I think going back to the earlier slide where we reported the COVID incremental expenses, we highlighted a lot being to be determined, because I think it's really unclear at this time what areas may be impacted. We talked about Superintendent Armstrong talked about transportation as an example. As we continue to explore, as the pandemic unfolds, as circumstances, the environment changes, we continue to look at those items, and it's really unclear as to what the total magnitude of impact it will have on the budget, if any. But we did try and highlight what costs can be calculated or fairly or determined reasonably at this time, given the knowledge we have now. And that was shown earlier. And I think those costs were about $3.6 million in excess of the funding.
Okay, thank you.
Trustee Higginson is up next.
Trustee Higginson?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Through you to administration, I want to say thank you for this this budget in times of, I mean, even last year, my first budget, we were responding very quickly in times of austerity, and now we are responding very quickly in times of austerity and pandemic planning and the health and safety of our staff and students. And I know the tremendous amount of pressure that you've been under to deliver this, and I want to say thank you for that. I hope that my fellow colleagues will have questions for you as well on this, and I think they'll all kind of be around the same vein as I just heard Trustee Leclerc ask. I need to express my profound disappointment in the lack of funding from the provincial government for us to cover our costs for COVID recovery and preparedness. So my questions are all around that. So we have this chart on page 12 of our package, allocations in addition on pages 40 and 41. And we just saw, and Mr. Mayhew, thank you for going through those costs again. They're the known costs that we have. The known costs are well exceeding $4 million. And these known and unknown costs are not insignificant. The unknown costs are not insignificant. They're things like transportation, which we know is going to be a significant expense. We have an occasional teachers line that that given that we're in a pandemic and we have health concerns in our communities, that line is going to increase as well. And we don't have any semblance at this point of funding coming to cover any of those things. So my questions are, where are these costs being taken from, the known and the TBD ones that we don't know about? And will the same solution be used for any of the costs moving forward that are unknown, even the ones that we don't, that kind of come up out of nowhere, the ones that we don't have currently TBD in charts? So I'm wondering if anyone can help me out with that.
This is Superintendent Armstrong. Those are great questions, so thank you for the questions. The challenge that we've explained in, nobody likes to put TBDs next to numbers, particularly when you're doing a budget presentation. I think some of the challenge is until we really understand better who will be attending school in person, who's attending remotely, who will opt out of taking transportation, for example. That's some of the factors that make it difficult to provide estimates on some of these items. We've projected at this point, based on what we do know, of $5.5 million, and we were pleased at least to get $1.8 million from the ministry allocation last week. We don't know if there will be additional funding announcements from the ministry. In terms of funding additional costs, as we've gone through this budget presentation, I think it's pretty clear that there's really no contingencies that are left in our budget. We've been very lean in terms of how we are spending the funding. The learning model could influence things. If we end up going to a remote model, then we may not be incurring some of these costs if schools are closed down. We have tried to purchase things where we can with unspent GS funding from last year. And if the worst case, we are also allowed or permitted under the compliance calculations by the ministry to utilize 1% of our operating revenue and fund through our surplus that's on our balance sheet.
I have supplemental to that.
Supplementary, yes.
Thank you. Thank you for that. So I again want to say thank you to the diligence of our administration for putting us in a position where we have such a healthy surplus for as the ministry wanted to call it, a rainy day, which this is several rainy days in a row. So I thank you for that and the acknowledgement that that we do require more funding in order to be able to move to this model. You did also mention moving to another model, to an online model, and the costs or savings that we could experience through that. What is the trigger point? Do we know at this point what the trigger point would be where we would have to shift our budget quickly in order to be able to do that? I know we're doing everything in this agile way, but what is the kind of trigger point, and what sorts of ways do we influence our ability to be able to have knowledge of that trigger point and adjust our budgets accordingly should we have any model changes? What is the kind of trigger point of those things?
I would think that, Superintendent Armstrong, we would be taking our direction from the Ministry of Education and from our local public health unit in terms of whether there needs to be a shift in the learning model. So that's not something, in particular that I'm aware of that we would make the independent decision on, but I would have to defer to the director regarding that. We're in constant, we've done a lot of costing analysis related to PPE and cleaning costs, and we've had those conversations with transportation. So in terms of assessing if circumstances change, we should be able to relatively quickly be able to assess, the potential costing impacts related to any changes that we may need to adapt to.
And if I can just add to that, it's Sean Mayhew. I mean, right now there's just, as we've highlighted, so much uncertainty that exists moving forward. And I think as that starts to play out in September, October, we have the opportunity now to reassess and to find out what the actual costs are at, how they're coming in, what the values are, what the need is, look at that model as it's changing, if it does change. And then there's the opportunity to build that into a revised budget in the fall. So in the fall, we always have to submit a revised budget in December to the ministry. And it would be at that time where we would reassess a lot of these unknowns that we've reported in that COVID chart, and look at any additional funding if we happen to be eligible for additional funding. That's always our hope. And then we'd also come up perhaps with a more robust plan as to what areas within our current budget can we reallocate to offset some of these additional expenses. There's some expenses that if circumstances change, that could be redirected to offset some of these. For instance, we saw that when we went into a remote learning model back in March, where some of our budget could be redirected to cover the costs of technology, et cetera. So there's a lot up in the air right now, and I think once we kind of hit the fall, we'll have a good idea of that kind of will be the trigger point really with respect to budgeting and the impact on the budget.
Mr. Chair, if you'll allow me one more supplemental just very quickly.
One more, yes.
Thank you. So in the revised budget, does that come back to the Board of Trustees, the revised budget for any decision making on our part, or is it just for information?
Superintendent Armstrong, typically, no, that is not required for trustees to approve revised estimates. We do, however, bring a report back to the board. I think it's in January, or it might be the February Ops and Finance Committee, where we would bring that forward. Although certainly we're sensitive to the expenditures and the nature of the expenditures that are related to the pandemic, and we would certainly be open to providing much a timelier update to the board as the information becomes available.
Thank you very much.
Trustee Burgess, question?
I think the director had a.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Kelly?
I just wanted to support what Mr. Mayhew and Superintendent Armstrong said, that information could be provided back to trustees. And remember too, through the ministry budget, we often get specific monies that are allocated for specific purposes. Professional development might be one, might be around personal protective equipment. So that money we would have to use for those purposes. So much of our funding is very specific and very sort of enveloped, I think. So sometimes it's not like that when we get this money, we can exactly decide where to spend it, but we can provide those updates of how that money was spent if we were allocated additional funds from the ministry, and it usually is with purpose. Just thought I would clarify.
Thank you.
Trustee Burgess, question? Trustee Burgess there? Doesn't seem so. Trustee Sipcar, question?
Hi, yes, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Through you, Mr. Chair, to Superintendent Armstrong and her team, thank you for this presentation and for all the work that has gone into the budget. I know that I've already asked a number of questions to you leading up to this meeting, and the one that I wanted to ask right now that we touched base about was our capital budget, and wondering specifically about some of the funding related to our school condition improvement funding, and then how we allocate that money. And I know that, we have a separate section for COVID that's kind of up front that outlines a lot of costs that we are incurring kind of on an ongoing basis. But I wondered about any sort of capital improvements that we are making in our schools, particularly some of the older schools in terms of ventilation and windows. And I wondered specifically I noted that this year we have 24.5 million, which is 0.2 million less than last year. So it's clear that the government hasn't put any additional funding in that envelope for us. I'm wondering, have we allocated any of these funds in the upcoming year to address some of these concerns with respect to ventilation systems, windows, filters? I've received a number of concerned emails, phone calls about this. I often talk about the old schools in our area, and I just wondered if we've specifically thought about this, and if it would even come from that school condition improvement funding. Thanks.
Okay, Superintendent Armstrong. I have also, and I think other trustees have some issues, have heard some issues from the general public, parents, etc., and teachers about ventilation. Is there a program that we can move on that as we go through the next year of operations?
Thank you for the question. When we get to the reopening plan, I'll be able to speak in a lot more detail about ventilation to try and provide a little bit more clarity. With respect to school condition improvement funding, primarily that funding is used for addressing major building components. So for example, 70% of that funding we would use for foundations, roofs, and windows as an example, and for systems. So HVAC being one of them, plumbing being another. And then the remaining funding, we can also use the 30% for building components, but we can also take a look at things like surrounding site components like utilities and parking and so forth. So certainly the intention of that funding is intended to deal with building components like you're suggesting, which is HVAC. I know through conversations I've had with Ms. Hinchliff, our manager of facility services, our older schools actually have better ventilation rates than some of our newer schools, which seems kind of odd. And in terms of how we spend that funding, the ministry, I think we did a workshop back in the winter time. The ministry does do an assessment of all of our building needs and identifies many of the critical components that require replacement or renovations. And the way we spend that funding is based on those assessments that are completed, based on, like I said, based on the assessments that were provided by the ministry. HVAC and window repairs, we've done a significant number of them in our schools. And certainly I can follow up with Ms. Hinchliff. I don't think that she's able to connect on this call right now, but we do upgrade everything based on product code.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, hi. Sorry. Yeah, I'm able to connect. Sorry about that. I apologize. Would you like me to add to that, Shelley?
No, you certainly can. Like I said, we do have funding through school condition funding to deal with that. We do focus on the life-saving features, life safety systems, in our schools, and it is informed on the assessments that are completed by the ministry. And certainly, Julianne, if you're able to add to that, that would be great.
Thank you. I appreciate that. We've spent a significant amount of school condition improvement in the last 5 years, improving our heating, cooling, and ventilation systems. And one of the key factors in any system is that whatever ventilation system is put into our new school, like into it that is replaced, has to be upgraded to today's building code, which is a significantly higher ventilation rate than any of the previous ones. So I can't go in and replace an air handler, for example, and put the same one back. We must upgrade to today's building codes and building standards, which are all informed by ASHRAE, which are quite stringent in terms of the amount of ventilation that is required for any space in our schools. Thank you.
So just a quick follow-up, if I can.
Yes.
I guess then my question is, and thank you for that. I appreciate knowing that a lot of our systems have been upgraded. Are there any specific COVID-related expenses that will hit our capital budget? I guess I just didn't see it anywhere. And I know that, ventilations is something that comes forward. And if there are specific requests, or like, have we done any assessments, or if it's, something comes up, where would that money be coming from?
I'm Superintendent Armstrong. I'm not aware of any COVID-related capital costs that we've identified at this time. Again, we continue to review the condition assessments of our schools, and we continue to work on projects with respect to updating HVAC and window replacements in the schools.
Okay, thank you. I see that Trustee Burgess is back, but I'd like to ask the Trustee Ching. She was right next, so does she have questions? And then we can go to Trustee Burgess.
Chairperson Halberstadt, Trustee Sartori is also in that queue. She is on the phone.
Who would be next? Sorry.
It would be Trustee Sartori.
Trustee Sartori, go ahead.
Okay, thanks all. So I had a couple of questions that are not related. So if you'd like me to wait until the next go around for my second question, I can do that. I just had a question following, a line of questioning earlier from Trustee Higgison. Do we have reassurance from the government that changes in our, numbers and stats in various areas across the board due to COVID-10, due to COVID-19 and the circumstances that boards across the province are in right now, that those, conditions and changes in our numbers and stats in our transportation needs, in enrollment, potentially if there are, many more families, that decide to do homeschooling, that these will be seen as temporary changes, for what they are, that they, may not be good data in order to make funding decisions on in later years. Now, we don't know how long, COVID-19 and these, these conditions and the situation are going to be with us. But that's my question. Do we have reassurance that changes that, we might not see evidenced in our budget right now, but, we might see at the end of this year, that those are temporary things? Do we have reassurance about that, and that, we can easily get back to, where we need to be when we understand what the new normal is going to look like?
Sorry, this is Superintendent Armstrong. I would suggest that the funding that we're being provided is defined by the grants for student needs. And as we had indicated, that funding is based on a conventional learning model. There's been no changes to that funding formula that considers the pandemic, other than the 10 million for and 15 million for the mental health supports and technology needs of students. Then further, last week there was that last announcement of $309 million investment by the ministry, of which we're getting $1.8 million. I'm not aware of any further funding announcements. Could they come? They could. Will there be any implications, because there are changes in terms of decisions that parents make in terms of homeschooling versus attending class in person versus taking remote learning? Not that I'm aware of right now, nothing that has been announced at this time.
Is there supplementaries, Trustee Sartori, or you want to come back later?
Yeah, I'll wait. Thank you.
Okay, Trustee Chin.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Chair. My question is regarding the funding for the smaller class size. As far as I know, the Toronto TDSB, they have passed a motion to make the class size smaller. I think it's under 15, and they, based on this, they are requesting the grant for more funding for the smaller size classes. Windsor, I think, is more serious based on the pandemic, and I wonder if we can considering requesting for the funding for smaller class size either. In case, I don't know how the provincial government will handle that if we don't request, if they are approved, are we missing the extra funding compared with other school board? I'm not sure, but I want to give you the, suggestion that we may think about that to prepare for the more funding request.
Oh, sorry, Linda. What was you identified a board that had done this? What was that?
TDSB, Toronto, Public School Board. Yeah, Public School Board.
Okay.
And pardon?
Somebody want to field that question?
Yeah, through you, Trustee Halberstadt. Yes, I understand the Toronto District School Board did advocate for that and has discussions with the ministry. The Director of Education of the Greater Essex County District School Board has certainly spoken to that we will need extra, and we could certainly make a plea for that, particularly for some of our areas, but we would have no guarantee of getting extra funding on that. Wherever we can, we will do our very best to reduce class size based on the decisions. I think that's going to depend quite a bit on who's coming back and who's not coming back, and in what mode of learning they're coming in. But that will, and again, we're gathering that information right now.
Okay. Okay. Can I ask another question, or I wait?
Yeah, I'm going to go around and then come back. So,
okay, thank you.
So, Trustee Burgess.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, because I'm having trouble, so I want to make sure. I have several questions, but I'm going to try to start with the premise. We're working on going through the numbers. I want to say thank you very much for such a comprehensive budget and comparison last year, budget to budget, comparison since our last update, comparison since the last memos and the last announcements of funding, etc. However, we do have tonight, and it's predicated on a plan that's going to be coming forward to the board, and there's a lot of assumptions that we've made. So the financial implications I need to understand. I couldn't watch any of the slides. I had to, the presentation was not available to me, so I was trying to match it with the binder. But on page 9, anyway, in our binder, it talks about what the technical briefing funding and requirements came to us, and it included distancing of 1 meter. We've made mention of ventilation. I heard in your presentation that you talked about installation of some barriers. I look at Appendix 13 and I see that there are classroom upgrades, but I'm not sure that the classroom upgrades, according to what I think I heard the answer to Trustee Sipkar's question, aren't related to COVID. So I know in many classrooms, and from the unprecedented amount of individual requests from parents, educators, public education supporters, people in the community, parents are not going to be making a decision based on the plan that's to us and in front of us tonight, and with all these assumptions that are to be determined. And it depends if the plea we make gets funding, etc. So are we committed to distancing of 1 meter? Will we not commit to something better? How much more would it cost? And knowing our infrastructure and how many interior rooms, for example, that with no windows and not being able to use fans and trying to find excess space, give us some idea of how much this could change, because I believe there's a political advocacy part to this. What I heard from the ministry is that we are to use our reserves. I see healthy reserves, and I think they're going to expect us to use healthy reserves. So if we had the ventilation that our parents and students and staff believe is necessary to operate whenever we go back to school, and the distancing that to be safe that we require, because we are in an anomalous region. I'm participating in this meeting a few miles from phase 1 hospital. I'm in phase 2 today. We go to phase 3 tomorrow, but I won't be acting like phase 3 because I know the level of stuff. So how much money do we actually need in addition to what you've put forward here to actually do this right, to serve the needs that we presently are in Greater Essex?
Who wants to take that one?
It's Director Kelly. That's a very tough question, Trustee Burgess, as you know. We still don't know how many students would be returning to our buildings. One of the challenges would be space. Obviously, if the issue is distancing, one of the greater distancing, the challenge would be space, and where would we put those students, for example. We would certainly work to do that. So that would be difficult to estimate based on, we're waiting for our numbers to see who would returning. I imagine that would certainly have additional cost coming with it, but to be able to pick a number out of the head, I don't know that any board in Ontario could do that right now. But there could be additional costs, right, with respect to space, if you're speaking class size, and we don't know how much PPE would be needed. All of those things could certainly play a factor. That it would, as you know, very hard to estimate.
Okay, supplementary, and then I'll go on.
Yeah, supplemental. So that isn't, I think that's truthful, but it's not reassuring. So I have a budget before me. I'm trying to, I want to acknowledge the tremendous amount of work and the tremendous amount of adjustment every time something new came, and, you know, but we have a budget here that we're in a catch-22. We're asking our parents to enroll kids, to continue to enroll kids, not take them out, to keep our funding at status quo or at levels of prediction anyway. And yet we're not making it attractive to them because we're not giving them the reassurance they need in capital improvements, in staffing improvements, in allowing for the real protocols we need to be putting in place in our region, because we haven't been phase 3 for weeks and weeks. You know, it's around the corner. School openings around the corner. We've sort of run out of time. So maybe my question is, why aren't we looking at reserves, at taking our reserves, because the ministry has said that's kind of where we have to go now. And I know it's a rainy day fund, but like if it's not raining now, when is it raining? So how willing are we to go into our reserves to make some changes to really up the game as far as safety and in all of our schools, particularly though in those that are, we know in Kingsville and Leamington, that have a much higher level of active cases and unreported cases in the general community. So what are we doing with reserves? Why did we not touch reserves and go somewhere that we needed to go?
For you,
We have 19,700 in reserves. So
Through the chair, the director can answer that. Yes, there is. You can certainly go into 1% of that, and we have built a healthy budget, which I am personally very proud of because it was much different a few years ago. Certainly, that would be an option if it would be related to COVID expenses, if that's what you're thinking. But it would certainly be within the marks of the 1% that the ministry would have dictated to us in our budget.
So just for clarification, when you say 1%, taking 1% out of reserves or going down to 1%? We've got about 4 now or something.
We can, yes, we could only use 1% of that. So it would amount to, I guess, around, and I looked to Superintendent Armstrong because you've been looking at the budget constantly, but I believe that's around $3.2 million.
Right, we could use 1% of our operating revenue, and I think that's noted on appendix, I don't know if it's appendix 1 or appendix 4. It's $4,249,000. $953,000 of our budget is a deficit for the unsupported capital projects, and that's part of the motion that was put forward. So if you net the $4,249,000 against the $953,000, you'd have available $3,200,000 and I'm just trying to do the math here. $3,295,000 that you could, in theory, go against your surplus for COVID-related expenditures, depending on what it was specifically that you wanted to use that funding for.
And the province wouldn't allow more than that 1% then?
Correct.
Yeah. Okay, I'd like to move on. We can come back later if we want. Question I have from Trustee Hatfield.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I didn't see the Premier's press conference today, but I believe that there was a statement made that there was money available to hire additional staff to lower class sizes if school boards requested it. So I'm not, I didn't personally hear that. That's just a message that I received today. And I wondered if administration could tell me more about that.
For you, Trustee Halberstadt, it's Director Kelly. I believe that he has announced a fund. We have no details or memo unless Superintendent Armstrong or Mr. Mayhew have received information on it, but I believe there is a fund. I think it's something like $33 million across the province, so I don't know what that would do, but of course, that's something that we would continue to advocate for getting back. Superintendent Armstrong, do you have any more details?
No, thank you, Director Kelly. There's been no announcement yet in terms of how that process would work. It is an application-based process is what we understand, but we haven't been provided with any details with respect to that.
So that'd be 33 million across the province, Director?
That is my understanding, although the information comes fast and furious, so I'm pretty sure that was the number, so.
Okay, supplementary.
Yes. So with regard to that 3.2 million that was just referenced, I wanted to know how I can, or I'd like to amend the motion to add in that 3.2 million to the COVID-19 expense line to give us more availability of funds to use them as we need them. So I would like to make an amendment to the motion that the operating budget, what's the number now? Sorry, I don't have it in front of me. So that the
3.2 million.
The 473 million and change, that to that number in the motion that we would add the 3.2 million that we can use and still be in compliance.
If I could speak to that, Trustee Hatfield?
Go ahead.
Yeah. I'm just wondering if you're going to do that, I guess what you would be doing is approving an operating budget of what we have now plus that 2, which I think is 476,000. Or I looked at Superintendent Armstrong for the fiscal period of September to August, resulting in a deficit for the purposes of compliance with the Ministry of Education, and put that what that amount is. Is that how that would happen?
Yes, that's what I'm looking to do. I'm looking to add the full amount that we're allowed, and still to be in compliance, and that it all go into the COVID line, so that it doesn't have to be specified, but that, you know, it could be used for whatever we might need as we move forward. So I'm making that amendment.
Superintendent Armstrong, I guess just for the math, I guess I'm working through the math. The motion, which reads 473,243,011, would now need to become 476,538,570.
Yeah.
And then we would be saying then we would have a deficit for compliance calculation of 4,248,933, of which we would have to use 953,434 for the drawdown of the accumulated capital surplus for the committed projects, and then that would give us the remaining of 3,295,559, if I've done my math right, to fund COVID-19 expenditures.
Yes, and if I can get a seconder, I would just like to make some quick statement on that amendment.
Is there a seconder?
Trustee Leclerc has seconded it.
Yeah.
Trustee who?
Leclerc.
Okay.
Oh, okay, so now that it's on the floor, just, oh, sorry. Am I on or not on?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay.
To
so,
it, right?
Yeah, so just quickly, I think that by taking this approach, it gives us a stronger case to, I hope, add a letter to the submission of the budget with very serious concerns that our board has, particularly given the fact that we're just weeks away from school opening and only now moving to stage 3. So I think that this gives us more ammunition to speak to the concerns of our community, as opposed to the previous number in the motion. And it does give us more to work with as we move forward to address the concerns. And I think it will also help us address some of the concerns in the proposed school reopening plan. So I hope that trustees will support the amendment, and then based on the fact that we're submitting a deficit position budget, that we would also consider sending a letter with our serious concerns. Thank you.
Okay, so the letter is also as part of the motion, is that right?
Well, I don't think I've ever let a budget go forward without expressing concerns in a letter to the shortcomings of the funding. So the letter isn't part of my motion, but I would at some point, if someone else doesn't do it, I would be suggesting that we send a letter.
Okay, is there any other comment on this motion before we take a vote or amendment? Doesn't seem to be.
Oh, yeah,
so,
I have Trustee Sartori.
It's
Trustee Sartori, please.
Oh, Trustee Sartori.
Yep. Is it my turn?
Yes, to speak to the motion.
Okay. Okay. I'm sorry. I can't see the queue. So I would like to hear from comments from administration on this. You know, just some comments from admin. Anything that potentially we are not thinking of as trustees, because we are, we're not in the same position as administration to have the same sort of in-depth view across the system. But I will say that, at this time, to me, this is why we have I'll call it a rainy day fund. It's for these reasons. And if we, unless I'm misunderstanding the reason to have reserves like this, if not now, then when? But I would like to hear from administration, please. Thank you.
Who wants that one?
Through you, Trustee Halberstadt, Director Kelly, I could answer that. I agree. There are times when you do a deficit budget. You probably know from how I feel about budgets that I'm very concerned always with being a balanced budget, that this may be a time, given the unknowns and the context in which you're in, that I think we are in a position where this could be manageable, and maybe Mr. Mayhew or Superintendent Armstrong have a better handle on that, but I know that we have built a fairly healthy surplus over the years by some really good hard work on the part of the Board of Trustees and staff, and so this may be a time, so I don't see any huge limitation to that unless my colleagues would disagree.
Okay.
Okay, thanks for that.
Alan, I'm just going to jump in for a minute as your vice chair and help you with the queue. So if no one else has comments on this, I didn't know. Trustee Higginson is next, and then myself.
Yeah, you're up, I think.
Is that me?
Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you. So thank you very much. Through you, Mr. Chair, I'm in support of this amendment, and if trustees would also be amenable, and to Trustee Trustee what's the other H we have, Hatfield, would be willing to make an additional amendment to it. I was thinking that in the event of changes to the budget for COVID preparedness and response, which you had mentioned, these would go into that line, that the budget shall be brought back to the Board of Trustees. I wonder if you'd be amenable to including that.
Trustee Sartori, I would support that as either a friendly amendment or an amendment to Trustee Hatfield's amendment.
If I could, as Director Kelly, how would you see that happening? I mean, we could certainly bring it back in terms of how those expenses were allocated within a COVID experience. Is that what you're thinking, so that you know how that money was spent?
Yes. Yes.
Right. Okay. All right. Thank you.
Would there be a timeline on that, Trustee Higginson?
In light of how things are moving, I wouldn't know what that would be.
So can I speak to that as the mover?
What's that?
Can I respond as the mover of the amendment?
To the action of bringing it back to the trustees?
Yes, there was a suggestion to amend the amendment. So can I speak to that? Yes?
I think you're muted, Alan. There you go.
It would be another amendment, second amendment.
So can I speak to that then? Because it's my amendment, my motion?
Sure, go ahead.
Okay, and correct me, Director Kelly, or give me some direction on this, but I don't think that the additions to the amendment is necessary, because administration always brings forward a report whenever the budget is revised, whenever there's additional funds received for whatever reason. Can you maybe the director or Superintendent Armstrong speak to that? Because I believe that that happens automatically without us having to request it.
Thank you. That's why I asked the question, Trustee Hatfield. I think that does happen. I wonder if Trustee Higginson is just asking, as we go forward, to explain some of the ongoing costs that we have with respect to COVID.
Oh.
I think that's more what you're talking about. I don't think we would be, if we have this money in our budget and we've given approval through this motion to spend it on COVID related, we would be doing that. So, but I think what you're saying is you want to know kind of the things that have occurred that we've had to spend money on, if that helps. So I would agree, not that I should be commenting on motions, but I would agree with Trustee Hatfield that it's understood and certainly not needing to be part of the motion. It might be a little bit confusing, actually.
That's what I was thinking, because I was confused, but I would think that this is going to be an exceptional year with regard to the amount of reporting that we get back from admin on everything related to COVID. So yeah, I was just a little bit confused myself. So I thought that the amendment could stand as it is. And
I want to go back to Trustee Higginson if she's okay with that there doesn't need to be an amendment, that it's understood.
Sure.
Thank you. Yes, I'm happy to do that. I just wanted, being a newbie here and dealing with these unknown circumstances, I just wanted it to be clear that it would come back to us, and so that we would know the expenses that were being made under anything that would go under that COVID line. I just wanted to make that very clear. So if that is as muddily clear as it possibly can be at this point, I'm okay with that.
Trustee Halberstadt, can I make a comment, just a clarification through you with respect to that request? That what you're asking for essentially is what we would incorporate in our quarterly trustee expense reports. So we would this additional amount that you're proposing be added to the motion. We would classify that as COVID on a separate line, and included in that report, we would put more robust details surrounding the expense as it unfolds throughout the year. So essentially, you will be getting the report of how that money is spent and what is spent each quarter.
Okay, is that okay with everybody?
Yeah, thanks, Sean, for that clarification.
Question again from Trustee Sartori about that.
Yes.
Thank you. I'm just wondering when we would see the impact of enrollment come back to us then, and after studying the first few weeks or however long of school reopening, or whatever that we would like to call it, at what point would administration be planning to bring that back? Because I would expect it to be sooner rather than later.
I think Mr. Mayhew addressed that. It would come back in the first quarter. Is that right? Is that correct, Sean?
Yeah, well, I think I can't speak for what other updates will be provided outside of the typical quarterly report. I imagine at each public meeting moving forward, there'd be a robust update as to how enrollments, how it's shaping up, and other items COVID related. As far as the financials go, though, upon the completion of the first quarter, we would finalize those reports and bring you back the report in typical fashion, as we usually do, explaining the expenses at that time. Of course, that would be delayed, though, right? Because we'd have to get through the first quarter so far. So perhaps we can provide verbal updates, or I'll turn to Director Kelly perhaps for more commentary on any other updates that we provided sooner rather than later.
I think Trustee Sartori, through you, Trustee Halberstadt, is referring to how do we get updates on enrollment. So whether students are attending, and we usually do bring that forward. I believe in November. Superintendent Houston, I know that you have done that before. We usually do bring enrollment. I think that's what you're talking about, Trustee Sartori, because we know that our enrollment impacts our budget.
Yeah, exactly. So I mean, usually, if my memory is correct, and if I'm understanding what you're saying too, we would see in November or around that time, typically after reorg, what do our enrollment numbers look like, and so forth. But will we see the potential impact on the budget at that time? Because otherwise, what I'm hearing is that we probably actually wouldn't see that until January if we're waiting for the first quarter, right?
Through you, Chair, we would bring an expense report to you in February, I believe, as part of the special ops and finance meeting that would explain the changes that or the impact enrollment has on revised budget, and we would explain essentially take the snapshot at October 31st, and that would feed into the revised budget process. The revised budget, I believe, is due December 15th. The submission to the ministry. I'm not sure if there's an opportunity to bring information sooner or not. That would have to be a discussion at the senior leadership team level.
Well, I'd say that's why we need the motion then.
Mr. Chair, I was going to say, Mr. Chair, you have myself in the queue on the amendment and also Trustee Burgess, and then there are 4 other people who want to ask questions in the queue as well. So I'm just letting you know.
Okay.
Am I okay to go ahead?
Yes, I saw you.
Okay. On the amendment, I just had a question. So I'm noting that we're putting aside 3.29 million, which puts us in compliance with the ministry. But on page 12, and as was noted in the presentation, we're actually sitting at about 3.6 million of unfunded COVID expenses that we're estimating, and that's without additional cleaning.
Mr. Chair, point of order, please. It's Trustee Sartori. So there was an amendment to an amendment, which was seconded. And the movers would be Trustee Higginson and myself, who seconded it. And so I think we're still on the amendment to the amendment and not the main amendment motion.
Point of information?
I think it was withdrawn by Trustee Higginson when it was explained when it would come back. That's my recollection.
As the mover?
So it's withdrawn?
Yeah, that was my understanding as well.
Yes.
Mine too.
So you have, Trustee Sipkar, you have something else?
Yep, I was just asking a question about how we're still, it looks like from my calculations with our, on page 12, we're sitting at about at least 400,000 roughly in unfunded COVID expenses that is not coming from that 3.295 million. I got interrupted there, so I'm not sure if it's like the thought is cohesive. And that's in addition to all of the TBD expenses. I'm curious what would happen if we end up having all of these other expenses and we're maxing out our surplus allotment that puts us in compliance with the ministry. So I'm just curious, Director, I guess through you, Mr. Chair, to Director Kelly or Superintendent Armstrong, do we see that the ministry is going to step in and where's that extra money going to come from?
Who wants to take that one?
Well, I can try and start. This is Superintendent Armstrong. I think we've tried to, I know the question's been asked before. The funding that we're getting is through the GSED, and the ministry has provided us $1.8 million. I don't know if there's going to be any further funding that's going to come from the ministry. We're certainly not the only board that has, every single board has the same challenges with trying to fund COVID and pandemic related expenditures with the monies that they've been allotted through savings in their budget, and whether there'll be additional funding or using their surpluses. So I appreciate the question. I honestly can't tell you whether we're going to get more funding or not. I don't know the answer to that.
If I can add to that, it's Sean Mayu. Just want to point out too, we don't know if those expenses too are accurate and what the TBD amounts will be and what budgets will be able to reallocate to offset those. I think the budget is an estimate at a point in time, and I just want to make sure everyone understands that there are so many uncertainties moving forward that if we just take this number here, we're not certain that 3.6 is the right number. We're just being very conservative in trying to present a risk to the budget that could come to fruition or not. based on the additional funding that may or may not be available to us, based on budget reallocation that may or may not be possible, based on use of accumulated surplus, etc. So just want to put it out there that this is really an estimate.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, yeah, it's a speculation right now. It's a guessing game. So I think we either got to go through with this or not. So is there any other comments on this before I call the question?
So it was Trustee Burgess on the amendment had one more comment.
Okay, Trustee Burgess.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and this is on the main motion, on the amendment to the main motion. So it's to use the reserves. I still am very hesitant. I support the amendment, but I'm still very hesitant that when we do approve this, knowing it's an estimate, that we stand out from the crowd amongst the other 72 school boards, because I do believe that Superintendent Armstrong is absolutely correct, and so is Director Kelly, in that every board is going to be asking for this. Every board is going to be scrambling for every dollar. This to me is a strategic move to give the ministry clear evidence that we're willing to go somewhere, but I don't want my support for this amendment to be misinterpreted in thinking that it's going to meet the needs, because I think we have before us with the explanation of the incremental expenses not included in the budget and the to be determined, and whatever else we don't have in our crystal ball, that it has to go. This approval of using the reserve means that we need to really highlight that we're not willing to not have reserves in the future, that these are ongoing expenses and they're urgent in Greater Essex, because we have a different situation than the other 71 boards. We have an urgent need to make additional improvements in cohorting, busing, ventilation, distancing, finding space, all of that. And it's urgent. We need to do things that other boards won't have to do in 4 weeks. That's my belief. That's my firm belief. So I want to make sure that we understand that that we're not using reserves thinking, oh, that's going to do everything. We need to know that this estimate still leaves us wanting.
I think we could do that probably with a letter. I think Trustee Hatfield mentioned the letters almost a foregone conclusion, so we can use strong language if we want. But also, I think you can't predict either how people are going to see this. So I think we have to vote on the motion, and if it passes, then we can see where we go from there to try to bring more attention to the uniqueness of our board.
Mr. Chair?
Yes.
Trustee Hatfield is asking for the final word on the amendment. I believe she is the last.
Go ahead, Gail.
Oh, thank you. So I'm hoping that the trustees will support this amendment, and it absolutely isn't the full answer to all our problems and concerns, but it's one of the tools in our toolbox that we have available to us. And I think it's incumbent upon trustees to pull out all the tools that we can at this point in time without all-out civil disobedience. This keeps us in compliance. It respects the work that's been done by administration to create this budget, but it is one thing that trustees can do that is just one small thing. It's not the be-all and the end-all in terms of the answers to our concerns, but it does help us, and it does help us emphasize our concerns. So I believe the procedure would be that we would vote on the amendment, and then when we get to the main motion, I think that's the time where I usually every year make a motion that we include a letter with our submission. So I think that's the way that that this should play out. So thank you
Okay.
very much.
I'd like to wind this up then. I will ask for a vote. All in favor of the motion of the amendment.
Support. Trustee Sartori, support.
Trustee Cook, support.
Trustee
Trustee
Zipcar,
Olmsted.
support.
Trustee Olmsted, support.
Trustee Chin, support.
Trustee Higginson, support.
Leclerc,
Trustee
support.
Burgess, support.
I don't know where we are.
I
Trustee
think-
Hatfield, support.
I think that was everyone.
And I will
Leclerc.
support too.
Thank you, everyone.
Okay.
Back to the
Yeah.
queue, it was Trustee Cook that was next, Mr. Chair.
Trustee Cook.
Thank you. Actually, Trustee Hatfield asked my question, and it was about, I was lucky enough to get into the chair's call yesterday. And they did mention that pot of money again, and that was going to be my question. So hopefully we just keep our eyes open, and if it is an application process, I hope we use that. Thank you.
Okay, is there any further questions on the budget?
Trustee Olmsted, then Trustee Higginson, then Trustee Chin.
Thank you
Trustee
through you.
Olmsted?
Thank you through you, Mr. Chair. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, thanks. I keep losing my connection out here. Just for clarification, on page 28 of the budget, it does say that the 2020-21 budget will be staffed at the secondary level according to the collective agreements at 23-1. I guess the agreements have negotiated class sizes of 23-1, and that funding will be provided at that level. But then we also know that the province has directed secondary classes to be in cohorts of 15. So do collective agreements trump the provincial directive, or how do we reconcile these vast differences in numbers? Because that's a big difference in terms of class size, and I know that a lot will be contingent on enrollment, but how exactly do we reconcile that difference in numbers? Because that would be increase of staff, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm just trying to figure out those numbers.
Yeah, it's Director Kelly. Yes, you're right. The class sizes have changed from 22-1 to 23-1 as of collective agreements. The order from the ministry for 24 of the school boards, which is us, would be putting them in cohorts of 15. So students would only be attending part-time. So from a budgetary perspective, I don't see it as having much effect, because those classes are then divided. Some students would be learning online, some students be learning in class. So while it may have a minor budget effect, I don't think it would be that significant. It's not like how do I put it? It's not like the student is there full time for that funding of the 23 students. Superintendent House, you might explain it better, but I don't see it have a huge budgetary impact.
So thank you for that. The class size does need to be the class size. We cannot go over the maximum. And to Director Kelly's point, so and that's a board average. So it's not every single class is 22. So for example, if a class is 30 students in it, they would be split between cohort A and cohort B and attending on alternate days. So we would never pierce the cap. We just need to maintain the 23-1, sorry, throughout the entire board in our secondary schools, which is what our staffing is based on.
Okay, so you don't foresee needing to hire additional staff right now to comply with the provincial directive?
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, who is next in the queue?
It looks like Trustee Chin, as Trustee Higginson indicated, she doesn't have a second question.
Go ahead, Trustee Chin.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Chair. My question is regarding the page 12. On page 12, the masks for students. And currently the requirement is from grade 4 above and to have mandatory masks. And I know other boards are making the motion to require all the students to have masks. And I also got a lot of concern from parents requesting that. So I'm wondering if we made a motion to request every students to have masks on, and if this number would have to be changed.
So I'm not sure if this is a budget matter. I think it would be discussed at the board meeting, at the special meeting tonight with regard to math.
If the grade 1 to 3 are required to have masks, and I think this number has to be increased, right? It's a projected number.
This is Superintendent Armstrong. So when we developed this number for masks for students, we used projected enrollment for students from grades 4 to 12 on the assumption of providing a non-medical mask for each student to have 2 masks each day. And we use costing based on the recent tenders that we went through as part of our PPE process. So that's how this number is developed. And it also includes amounts for slippage is what we call. So in case a student also loses a mask or it gets spoiled in some manner. So it is based on students from grades 4 to 12.
So
supplementary, sorry.
Yeah, so is that possible to make a adjustment if all the students are included?
You're saying make it mandatory from 1 to 3?
Yes.
If I could, it's Director Kelly. I think that's something that should go in the perhaps in the more public board meeting, and certainly we would accommodate that within. Should that be? It's a policy issue, I would see.
Yes, that's what I was saying. You can bring it. You can revisit that at the later meeting tonight.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Is there any other comments in the queue?
I believe Trustee Burgess.
Sorry. Go ahead, Trustee Burgess.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And it's on the actual ability to fulfill what we want to do with this budget, even with all the provisos and the unknowns. My understanding, looking at what was presented, is that we had what 8.6 million is what I've got down here for occasional absenteeism, basically due to illness. We don't have any projections for this year. Do we know for sure that if we really got the model that we wanted, and I'm going to say that the model that's presented isn't what I want, to have a really robust amount of occasional teachers, EAs, ECEs, support for lower class sizes, and do we have the ability to recruit and staff at the levels when we were next in the regular public board meeting? Right now we're dealing with the budget. In our budget, even with the reserves, do we have the ability to do that, increase our staffing? Is that possible? Like what's the logistics of actually getting the people, the bus drivers, everybody that we need?
It's Director Kelly. Obviously, we're still working it out, finding out how many students are coming back. There may be challenges, as you noted, about bus drivers. That could be a challenge for us. All of those things are coming into certainly our questioning. And, you know, if even availability of occasional teachers, such will be, you know, things that boards are concerned about, not just our board. Thank you for noting that.
So supplemental, it's the catch-22 part of this, Mr. Chair. we have to have so many things with such certainty and make it attractive, because there's a high level of apprehension about how safe our schools are going to be, even with all the valiant effort and all the valiant costing and anticipation of what we're going to need. We have to make it attractive. So if we don't send that signal that we absolutely can do this, how can we give confidence to parents to make the choice in the next week or two when they don't really honestly know what they're getting?
I think that's a hypothetical question. I don't know if it's a straight answer. Could be given.
Well, it's our funding is dependent upon signaling that we are offering conditions that parents feel safe in attending school, that we're going to be able to staff adequately, that we're going to be able to present what we need. We require, I believe, more staff. So I don't know how we send that signal, but I wondered what plans were underway to recruit, to get folks that are qualified, to have them on deck, to interview the HR part of it.
I think Superintendent House could speak to that, because I know she's been doing a lot of hiring and getting ready.
So thank you. To your questions, Trustee Burgess. So well aware that yes, we're staffed based on our current FTE. So some staff may be in a position due to accommodations that they may not physically be able to return to a school and would be designated to support our remote learners. We also do have caps in our collective agreements around the number of additional, whether it be support staff or teaching staff. And those would need to be discussions with our union partners and federation around increasing those caps in the event that we feel that that's necessary. I can say that at this point in time, we're monitoring it every day and don't feel that we would be in a position where we need to do that. However, we all know that things change all the time, but we're keeping a very close eye at when we may need to give notice that we would need to increase our caps if necessary. And then we do have an abundance of applications ready to be interviewed if we need to do that.
Okay. I have a couple questions of Superintendent Houston. The trustees, I know I have, and I'm sure everybody else has. There are a lot of form letters or emails that we're getting. People want a cap of 15 student cap in elementary. Yeah, my question is, what would the cost be if this board took on that burden with regard to all of our elementary schools, 55 I think they are, were to have a cap of 15? And also, what would the possibilities be as far as the available space in our schools to accommodate 15 student cap in our elementary schools?
It's Director Kelly and Superintendent Houston, you can add to this, but I believe that expense would not be viable. It would be a very big change in a budget. The exact amount, we don't know our enrollment yet, but it would be certainly substantive. And the space would be a significant issue in certain areas in particular.
Yeah, my sense is, and I've looked into this, is that it would wipe out our reserve big time and put us into perhaps flirting with bankruptcy if we hired all those teachers and went into the schools and provided space somehow that really isn't available.
I agree, Trustee Halberstadt. It would be extremely cost prohibitive.
Okay, any other questions before I ask for a motion to support this budget?
I don't know if this is appropriate, Mr. Chair, but I'd like to bring up the issue of the letter. I did have a conversation with a number of trustees, and if Trustee Hatfield will, I guess, be okay with this. I had a letter that I kind of drafted last night that detailed a list of all of our unfunded costs, our unique situation at the Greater Essex County District School Board, which I think we've kind of, we'll get to a little bit later tonight as well, where our gaps and our risks are from a budgetary perspective, and also just an ask for an increase in funding for all these costs, but also for the reduced class sizes at the elementary level. I did circulate it with several trustees, also the chair and the director. And so if Trustee Hatfield is okay with that, I just ask for consensus as the basis for the letter, and we can send that alongside of passing our budget.
Do you have the wording of the? I did see it. I know you provided it to me.
I could read the whole thing, but it's like it's like 1.5 pages. I don't know if we want to go there. It looks like Trustee Cook has a comment on that.
I was just going to say that I totally agree that we need to write a letter, and yes, we talked earlier, but I just would like to see the letter again before voting on it. I also sent some information out to trustees because I was going to make a motion about sending a letter also. I just, I would feel better if we could hear or see what you propose for that letter first.
Just to quickly respond to Trustee Cook, I'm totally comfortable with just sending it out like as to the trustees as a draft and wordsmithing it and any additions that need to be made. It was simply a list of thoughts that I knew needed to be expressed to the ministry in order to advocate for our region. I think that Trustee Burgess has also indicated that she would like to add some things and edit, and it needs some editing as well. So yeah, no problem with that. And it looks like Trustee Hatfield has a response to that as well.
Trustee Hatfield, let's try to get this together. I don't think we want to have dueling letters.
No, thank you. I just want to fall back on the practice that we have done pretty much every year, because we've always had shortfalls in funding regardless of COVID, especially in the areas of special needs. So it's been almost an annual thing that we include a letter with our budget submission, and the practice that we have done in the past is that by consensus, trustees have agreed to include a letter. Trustees have agreed generally to the concerns that they want to have included, and I think a lot of that has been pointed out already tonight. And then what's happened is between administration and the chair, the letter gets drafted, gets sent out to the trustees for comment, and then when everybody feels that it has everything included that they want to say, then the letter gets sent. And I think that's the most efficient way to do it, and we have lots of precedent that that's the way it's always been done. So I don't think we need to try and put the letter together tonight, but if we could get consensus that we're going to do the letter. And I would also like to just say that I want the letter to be very strongly worded with regard to our needs. Thank you.
And I agree.
Okay, and I think what could happen is trustees, if they have some points they want to be made, that they could pass them along through emails to the, I guess, to the director and to the chair, so that they can have an idea of what should go in there. And I certainly could use Trustee Sipkar's points, and I haven't seen Trustee Cook's, but I'm sure we could use them too.
That sounds good.
And with that, it looks like Trustee Leclerc is asking to call the question. I guess I don't know if you need consensus. I think there was, but you should probably ask first. But Trustee Leclerc did ask to call the question.
Call the question. All in favor? We're talking about the. No, let's see what we're talking about.
Mr. Chair, you have to ask whether we want to call the question. I have support. I want to give support for calling the question.
Do we have consensus on the letter? Have we established consensus?
I think we do. That's be my ruling on that. We do have consensus.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so now we were going to the main motion, and it's the motion to be called. All in favor?
Trustee Sartori, support.
Trustee Chin.
Support.
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 Support, Trustee Higginson.
It
Well,
looks like everyone in the chat would make us to just me and you, Alan. So support, and someone said support as amended with letter to follow.
Yes, and I support. And that passes. So I guess we're up to an adjournment. There's no, we'll convene into the special public meeting at 7 o'clock. Anything further?
Just as a point of clarification, can we get the wording from Madame LeBook perhaps on the all the numbers that from that motion that we just amended?
Yes, I will send that via email.
Thank you.
Okay.
There was just one number amended, is that correct? In the motion? In the motion, yeah.
No, it was more than that.
Oh, sorry. Just
no
ignore me.
That's okay, I'll send it in an email.
Okay. Going to move along till we'll see you at 7 o'clock, I guess.
Okay, thank you.
See you at 7.
Thank you.
Thank you, Trustee Hopperster.
Thank you all.
Thank you.